Imagine a 7-year-old boy, abandoned by his parents, living in a reform school in Baltimore. A child so troubled that his own family declared him incorrigible. Now imagine that same boy growing up to become the most famous athlete in American history, a man whose name would become synonymous with greatness. This is the story of George Herman Ruth Jr., better known to the world as Babe Ruth, the Bambino, the Sultan of Swat. He did not just play baseball, he transformed it. He did not just break records, he shattered the very concept of what was possible in the sport. And his journey from the streets of Baltimore to becoming America's first true sports superstar is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of athletics. So sit back, because today we are diving deep into the life and legacy of a man who changed not just baseball, but American culture itself. George Herman Ruth Jr. was born on February 6, 1895, at 216 Emory Street in the Pigtown neighborhood of Baltimore, Maryland. The house belonged to his maternal grandfather, Pius Schamberger, a German immigrant and trade unionist. Both of Ruth's parents, Catherine Schamberger and George Herman Ruth Sr., were of German ancestry. As a child, young George even spoke German at home. His father worked a series of jobs, from lightning rod salesman to streetcar operator, before eventually becoming a counterman in a family-owned combination grocery and saloon business. The Ruth family lived above various saloons in a tough waterfront neighborhood where danger lurked around every corner. Life was brutal for the Ruth family. Of the 8 children born to George Sr. and Catherine, only 2 survived infancy, George Jr. and his younger sister Mamie. The constant tragedy, combined with the demands of running a saloon, meant that neither parent had much time for their surviving son. Catherine was often sickly, and George Sr. worked long hours. Left largely unsupervised, young George roamed the rough waterfront streets of Baltimore. He fell into trouble early and often, skipping school, drinking, chewing tobacco, and taunting local police officers. He engaged in petty theft and vandalism. By all accounts, he was a handful that his busy parents simply could not control. Shortly after his 7th birthday, in 1902, George Ruth Sr. and Catherine made a difficult decision. They petitioned the Baltimore courts to declare their son incorrigible and sent him to live at St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, located on the outskirts of the city. This Catholic institution, run by the Zavarian brothers, was part orphanage, part trade school, and part reform school. For most children, being sent away at such a young age would have been devastating. But for George Ruth, St. Mary's would prove to be his salvation. The rules were strict, and the brothers enforced discipline, but they also taught vocational skills and encouraged sports. Most importantly for young George, it was at St. Mary's that he discovered his extraordinary talent for baseball. At St. Mary's, George met the man who would change his life forever. Brother Matias, the school's prefect of discipline. Brother Matias was a towering figure, standing well over 6 feet tall and commanding immense respect from the boys through both his physical presence and his fundamental fairness. The Canadian-born priest became a father figure to the troubled young boy. Ruth would later say of him that he taught me to read and write, and he taught me the difference between right and wrong. He was the father I needed and the greatest man I have ever known. Brother Matias spent countless afternoons with young George, tossing worn-out baseballs into the air and swatting them out to the boys. Ruth watched in amazement. He would recall years later that he had never seen anything like that in his life. He said he thought he was born as a hitter the first day he ever saw Brother Matias hit a baseball. The older man worked tirelessly with George, teaching him to hit, field, and pitch. For hours at a time, they would practice together, honing the skills that would one day make Ruth the most feared hitter in baseball history. Brother Matias also played a role in turning George into a pitcher. Legend has it that one day George was teasing his team's pitcher, who was having a rough outing. Brother Matias responded by putting George into the game as a reliever. The young man pitched brilliantly, and from that day forward, he became a regular pitcher. Ruth's running and hitting styles would closely resemble those of his beloved mentor for the rest of his life. The bond between the troubled boy and the patient priest was remarkable. As biographer Robert W. Creamer noted, Ruth revered brother Matias, which was extraordinary, considering that Matias was in charge of making boys behave, and Ruth was one of the great natural misbehaviors of all time. By the time George was 15, his exceptional baseball skills had become the talk of St. Mary's. The brothers recognized his talent and began inviting scouts to watch him play. In February 1914, Jack Dunn, the owner of the minor league Baltimore Orioles, came to observe the 19-year-old George Ruth in action. Dunn watched Ruth for less than an hour before offering him a contract for $600 for the season. Since George was only 19 and still technically a ward of St. Mary's, Dunn had to become Ruth's legal guardian to complete the paperwork. This arrangement would soon give rise to the most famous nickname in sports history. When Ruth arrived at spring training in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in early March 1914, it was likely his first trip outside the Baltimore area. The train journey itself was an adventure for a young man who had spent most of his formative years behind the protective walls of St. Mary's. The rookie ballplayer was the subject of various pranks by veteran players, but he also earned a new identity. There are various accounts of how George Ruth came to be called Babe, but most center on his being referred to as Dunny's Babe or Jack's newest babe. The innocent, wide-eyed young man, so new to the world outside St. Mary's, seemed like a baby compared to the hardened veterans. The nickname stuck, and George Herman Ruth Jr. became Babe Ruth, a name that would echo through sports history for over a century. Ruth quickly distinguished himself on the diamond during spring training. In 2 outings against the Philadelphia Phillies, he faced 29 batters and allowed only 6 hits and 2 unearned runs. The following week, he threw a complete game victory over the Philadelphia Athletics, winners of 3 of the last 4 World Series. The talent was undeniable. Despite the Orioles' success on the field, the team was struggling financially. By late June 1914, Dunn found himself in a difficult position, with paid attendance dropping to as low as 150 fans. He had no choice but to sell his best players to raise money. On July 4, 1914, Ruth's contract, along with those of pitchers Ernie Shaw and Ben Egan, was sold to the Boston Red Sox of the American League. Ruth arrived in Boston on July 11, 1914. And that very afternoon, he won his first game as a Red Sox pitcher, defeating the Cleveland Naps 4-3. His catcher that day was Bill Carrigan, who was also the Red Sox manager. Carrigan became a mentor to the young Ruth, even rooming with him and teaching him the fundamentals of the game. It was also on that day, according to Ruth's own account, that he met Helen Woodford, a 16-year-old waitress at Lander's coffee shop. Ruth said she served him when he had breakfast there. Within a few months after the season concluded, the two were married on October 14, 1914. Babe was 20 years old and Helen was just 17. They were married that autumn. In his first full season with the Red Sox in 1915, Ruth finished with an impressive 18 wins and 8 losses as a pitcher, along with a batting average of .315 and 4 home runs. The Red Sox won the American League pennant that year, though Ruth was not called upon to pitch in the World Series against the Philadelphia Phillies. Boston won in 5 games. 18 wins marked a strong start to his major league career. The following year, 1916, Ruth emerged as one of the best left-handed pitchers in baseball. He compiled a record of 23 wins and 12 losses, leading the league with an earned run average of just 1.75. He also pitched 9 shutouts, the most for American League lefties that season, a record that would stand until Ron Guidry equaled it in 1978. In the 1916 World Series against the Brooklyn Robins, Ruth delivered one of the most remarkable pitching performances in postseason history. In Game 2, he engaged in a tightly contested duel with Brooklyn's Sherry Smith. After giving up an inside-the-park home run to Hy Myers in the first inning, Ruth settled in and threw scoreless ball for the next 13 innings. The Red Sox won 2-1 in 14 innings, the longest pitching outing in baseball postseason history. Ruth continued his dominance in 1917, going 24 wins and 13 losses with a 2.01 earned run average and an astonishing 35 complete games in 38 starts. By then, he had displayed enormous power in his limited plate appearances, and it was becoming clear that his hitting was too valuable to be left out of the lineup on a daily basis. In 1918, Ruth tied for the major league lead in home runs with 11, while also going 13 wins and 7 losses on the mound. The Red Sox won their 4th World Series title in 7 seasons that year, with Ruth contributing both as a pitcher and a hitter. He extended his record of consecutive scoreless innings in World Series play to 29 2/3 innings, a record that would stand for over 40 years until Whitey Ford broke it. By 1919, Ruth had made the full transition from pitcher to everyday player. That season, he smashed 29 home runs, obliterating the previous single-season record of 24 set by Ned Williamson in 1884. The baseball world had never seen anything like it. Here was a former pitcher who could hit the ball farther and more often than anyone in history. In just over 5 seasons with the Red Sox, Ruth had established himself as one of the premier left-handed pitchers in the game, winning 89 games and losing 46. He was also a member of 3 World Series championship teams. But all of that was about to change with one of the most controversial transactions in sports history. On December 26, 1919, Boston Red Sox owner Harry Frazee made a decision that would haunt his franchise for 86 years. He sold Babe Ruth's contract to the New York Yankees. The circumstances surrounding the sale were complex. Frazee was a theatrical producer who was hemorrhaging money because his Broadway productions were struggling. Despite a pennant-winning season in 1918, dwindling wartime attendance had caused the club's gate receipts to drop significantly. Ruth, fully aware of his value and baseball's growing popularity, was demanding his salary be doubled to $20,000 per year, twice what even the great Ty Cobb was making. Yankees owners Jacob Ruppert and Tillinghast Houston offered Frazee a deal he felt he could not refuse: $100,000 in cash, plus a loan of $300,000 secured by a mortgage on Fenway Park. The sale price was unprecedented, the highest ever paid for a baseball player at that time. Frazee tried to downplay the effects of the sale, calling Ruth selfish and claiming the Yankees were taking a gamble. But the gamble paid off spectacularly for New York. The Red Sox, winners of 5 of the first 16 World Series, would not win another pennant until 1946, or another World Series until 2004, a drought that became known as the curse of the Bambino. The Yankees, on the other hand, had never won an American League championship before acquiring Ruth. With him, they would win 7 pennants and 4 World Series titles. The franchise that had once played in the shadow of the New York Giants would become the most successful team in baseball history, eventually capturing 41 pennants and 27 World Series championships. When Babe Ruth arrived in New York in 1920, baseball was in crisis. The Black Sox scandal of 1919, in which 8 Chicago White Sox players were accused of intentionally losing the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds, had shattered public confidence in the sport. Attendance was down, and the integrity of America's pastime was in serious question. Ruth almost single-handedly saved baseball. In his first season as a Yankee, he shattered his own single-season home run record by hitting an astonishing 54 home runs, 25 more than he had hit in 1919. No other team in the American League combined hit more than 56 home runs that year. The entire Cleveland Indians roster hit just 26. The Yankees drew 1.29 million fans in 1920, setting a new attendance record. Ruth's popularity made the team the most talked about in baseball. His performances were so stunning, so beyond the known standards of the day, that they inspired a new sports adjective, Ruthian. The following season, Ruth did even better. In 1921, he launched 59 home runs, drove in 171 runs, scored 177 runs, batted .376, and posted an unheard-of .846 slugging percentage. Many consider it the greatest offensive season in baseball history. The numbers were so staggering that they seemed almost fictional. Ruth's drawing power was so immense that the Yankees were able to finance the construction of their own stadium. In 1923, the magnificent new Yankee Stadium opened in the Bronx, immediately dubbed by sports writer Fred Lieb as the house that Ruth built. On opening day, April 18, 1923, an astounding 74,200 fans flooded through the turnstiles, while another 25,000 were turned away. The previous attendance record for a single game had been 42,000. In a fitting twist, the first game at the new stadium was played against the Boston Red Sox, Ruth's former team. And in a moment that seemed scripted by destiny, Ruth hit the first home run in Yankee Stadium history, a 3-run blast that gave the Yankees a 4-1 victory. His wife, Claire, would later say it was the proudest moment of his life. She said he talked about that home run more than any other, including his 60th. From 1926 through 1932, Ruth's offensive output towered over all other players in the game. It was dominance. During those 7 seasons, he averaged 49 home runs per year, batted in 151 runs, and maintained a batting average of .353, while leading the Yankees to 4 league pennants and 3 World Series championships. But it was 1927 that would become the stuff of legend. That year, Ruth was part of a lineup known as Murderer's Row, considered by many to be the greatest team ever assembled. The batting order of Earle Combs, Mark Koenig, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Bob Meusel, and Tony Lazzeri struck fear into every opposing pitcher. The 1927 Yankees finished with a record of 110 wins and 44 losses, winning the American League pennant by 19 games. They batted .307 as a team, slugged .489, and scored 975 runs. They outscored their opponents by a record 376 runs. Ruth led the charge with one of the most remarkable individual seasons in baseball history. He batted .356, drove in 164 runs, scored 158 runs, walked 137 times, and slugged .772. But it was his home run total that captured the nation's imagination. Entering September, Ruth was locked in a friendly competition with his teammate Lou Gehrig for the home run crown. Gehrig had briefly taken the lead in early September, but Ruth responded with a furious stretch run. He hit 17 home runs in September alone, including 2 on September 29th to tie his own record of 59. On September 30th, 1927, the final day of the season, Ruth stepped to the plate against Washington Senators pitcher Tom Zachary. In the 8th inning, with the score tied 2-2, Ruth launched a pitch into the right field bleachers for his 60th home run of the season, 60th. After the game, Ruth exulted. "Let's see some son of a bitch try to top that one." That record would stand for 34 years until Roger Maris hit 61 in 1961. But the context of Ruth's achievement makes it even more remarkable. In 1927, no other American League team combined hit more than 56 home runs. Ruth out-homered entire franchises by himself. The 1927 Yankees capped their legendary season by sweeping the Pittsburgh Pirates in 4 games in the World Series. The National Leaguers were reportedly so demoralized after watching the Yankees take batting practice before Game 1 with ball after ball sailing into the seats that they never recovered. The legend of Murderer's Row was complete. If there is one moment that encapsulates everything about Babe Ruth, his showmanship, his confidence, his larger-than-life persona, it is the legendary called shot in the 1932 World Series. The Yankees faced the Chicago Cubs, and tension between the two teams had been building for weeks. Former Yankees shortstop Mark Koenig had helped the Cubs reach the World Series after being acquired mid-season, but his teammates had voted to give him only a half share of their bonus money. When Ruth heard about this, he lambasted the Cubs in the press, calling them cheap bums and chiselers. The Cubs responded with a torrent of profanity from their dugout, and their fans joined in, reportedly cursing and spitting on Ruth and his wife Claire as they arrived at Wrigley Field for Game 3. The atmosphere was electric with hostility. Ruth had already hit a 3-run homer in the first inning when he came to bat in the 5th, with the score tied 4-4. Cubs pitcher Charlie Root threw strike 1, and Ruth held up one finger toward the Cubs dugout. After strike 2, he made another gesture, this one more dramatic, pointing either toward Root, the Cubs bench, or the center field bleachers, depending on whose account you believe. On the next pitch, Ruth crushed the ball over the center field fence, reportedly nearly 500 feet. As he rounded the bases, he laughed at the stunned Cubs players. Lou Gehrig followed with his own home run, and the Yankees won 7-5 on their way to a 4-game sweep. Did Ruth actually call his shot? The debate has raged for nearly a century. Reporter Joe Williams wrote the next day that Ruth had pointed to center field before delivering. Ruth himself initially said he was showing the Cubs he still had one strike left, but later embraced the legend, saying, "It is in the papers, is it not?" Even a film of the at-bat discovered decades later proved inconclusive. What is certain is that in a hostile environment, with thousands of fans screaming against him, Ruth delivered one of the most dramatic moments in sports history. As one historian noted, what always gets diminished in the controversy about whether it was a called shot is that it was an unbelievable moment in which a player was challenged, and Ruth responded emphatically, as only he could. Off the field, Babe Ruth lived a life as large as his on-field exploits. He was a man of enormous appetites, famous for his love of food, drink, and good times. Stories abound of Ruth consuming 20 hot dogs and 8 sodas between games of a doubleheader, or spending nights partying until dawn before hitting home runs the next afternoon. His marriage to Helen Woodford was troubled almost from the start. Though he gave her furs, an 80-acre farm in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and adopted a daughter named Dorothy in 1921, he gave her neither time nor fidelity. His countless affairs caused Helen to have nervous breakdowns, and the couple eventually separated in 1925, though as Catholics they never divorced. In 1923, Ruth met Claire Hodgson, a beautiful model and showgirl from Athens, Georgia. Claire had come to New York with her daughter Julia after her first husband died in 1921. She and Ruth began an affair that would continue for years while he remained married to Helen. Then tragedy struck in January 1929 when Helen died in a mysterious house fire. Just 3 months later, on April 17, 1929, Ruth married Claire in an early morning ceremony on opening day at Yankee Stadium. The marriage transformed Ruth's life. Claire became his personal manager, controlling his outrageous spending and monitoring his eating habits. She brought stability and discipline to a man who had known little of either throughout his life. The blended family included Dorothy, whom Claire adopted, and Julia, whom Ruth adopted. They lived in a 14-room apartment in New York, along with Claire's mother and 2 brothers. By all accounts, Ruth was a devoted father who adored his daughters. He was the greatest dad, both daughters would later say. Ruth was also known for his generosity, particularly toward children. He made countless visits to sick children in hospitals, often without seeking publicity. He would sign autographs for hours, never turning away a young fan. The boy who had been abandoned at age 7 never forgot what it felt like to be a child in need. By the early 1930s, Ruth's playing skills were beginning to decline. Never the most physically fit player, his conditioning deteriorated to the point that running and fielding became difficult, though he could still hit. After the 1934 season, his last with the Yankees, Ruth desperately wanted to become a manager, but no offer came from New York. In February 1935, Ruth signed with the Boston Braves, returning to the city where his major league career had begun. The Braves promised him titles of vice president and assistant manager, hinting that he might eventually take over as skipper. But it was all a charade. Owner Emile Fuchs simply wanted Ruth to boost gate receipts for his struggling franchise. Ruth's time with the Braves was brief and painful. He struggled at the plate and in the field, hitting just a .181 batting average with 6 home runs. But he saved one last moment of glory for the end. On May 25, 1935, in Pittsburgh against the Pirates, Ruth went 4 for 4 with 3 home runs, including a towering blast that sailed completely out of Forbes Field, the first time anyone had hit a fair ball over the right field roof. That final home run, his 714th career blast, would remain the all-time record until Hank Aaron broke it in 1974. Ruth was urged to retire on that high note, but he had given his word to play through Memorial Day. His final major league appearance came on May 30th, 1935, in Philadelphia. He retired on June 2nd, ending a career that had spanned 22 seasons. After retirement, Ruth hoped to manage a major league team, but the opportunity never came. Some said his wild reputation made owners reluctant to give him that responsibility. He served briefly as a coach for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1938, but spent most of his remaining years playing golf, fishing, and making personal appearances. In 1936, Ruth was among the first 5 players elected to the newly established Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, alongside Ty Cobb, Honus Wagner, Christy Mathewson, and Walter Johnson. It was fitting recognition for a man who had transformed the sport. In the fall of 1946, Ruth was diagnosed with a malignant tumor on his neck. It was throat cancer. His health deteriorated rapidly over the following months, though he continued to make public appearances when he could. He became one of the first cancer patients to receive both radiation and chemotherapy treatment. On June 13, 1948, Ruth made his final appearance at Yankee Stadium for the ballpark's 25th anniversary celebration. The man who had once seemed so invincible now looked frail and thin, using a bat as a cane. His voice, once booming, had been reduced to a hoarse whisper by the cancer. The photograph taken that day by Nat Fine, showing Ruth from behind as he stood near home plate, looking out at Ruthville, became one of the most iconic images in sports history. 2 months later, on August 16, 1948, Babe Ruth died at Memorial Hospital in New York City. He was 53 years old. His body lay in state at the entrance of Yankee Stadium, and over 100,000 mourners came to pay their respects to the man who had built the house. Thousands more attended his funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Baseball Commissioner Happy Chandler spoke for millions when he said that his death would be a deep distress. He said that Ruth was one of his personal friends, and that it grieved him greatly that the nation had lost him. What Babe Ruth meant to baseball and to America cannot be measured in statistics alone, though his numbers remain staggering. He finished his career with a .342 batting average, 714 home runs, and 2,214 runs batted in. His career slugging percentage of .690 remains the highest in Major League history. His on-base percentage of .474 is second only to Ted Williams. He led the league in home runs 12 times, including 11 seasons of 40 or more, the most in history. He held or shared about 60 records at the time of his retirement. His World Series record of 29 2/3 consecutive scoreless innings pitched stood for over 40 years. But beyond the numbers, Ruth fundamentally changed how baseball was played. Before him, teams relied on bunts, base stealing, and small ball strategies. Ruth introduced power hitting as the centerpiece of the game. Between 1918 and 1921, stolen bases in the majors dropped from nearly 2,000 to under 1,500, while home runs increased from 235 to 937. Total runs rose from about 7,300 to nearly 12,000. He was also America's first true sports celebrity, a figure who transcended athletics to become a cultural icon. In an era before television, Ruth's fame spread through newspapers, newsreels, and radio. He appeared in movies, advertisements, and vaudeville shows. His rags to riches story, from abandoned child in a Baltimore reform school to the highest-paid athlete in America, embodied the American dream during the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. Ruth arrived at the perfect moment in history. Coming after the Black Sox scandal that had threatened to destroy public faith in baseball, his talent and charisma restored the sport's integrity and drew fans back to ballparks in record numbers. He helped mold baseball into the beloved national pastime it remains today. Sports writer Tommy Holmes, who covered Ruth for years, perhaps said it best. Some 20 years ago, I stopped talking about the Babe for the simple reason that I realized that those who had never seen him did not believe me. Nearly 80 years after his death, Babe Ruth remains the standard by which all baseball greatness is measured. His records have been broken, some controversially during the steroid era, but his legend endures. The abandoned boy from Pigtown became the greatest player the game has ever seen, a titan who towered over his sport like no athlete before or since. His life story reminds us that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely places, that a child declared incorrigible can become a national hero, that someone who starts with nothing can achieve everything, that even in our darkest moments there is always hope for redemption and glory. That is the story of Babe Ruth, the Sultan of Swat, the Bambino, the man who saved baseball and became an eternal American legend. Like and subscribe for more baseball documentaries. Until next time.